We are back, and we have got another leak from the United States Supreme Court. Abby Van Sickle and Jody Cantor in the New York Times. Breaking news with some behind-the-scenes intrigue from the quite controversial process of the court's announcement in the fall of 2023 of its widely criticized ethics code. The court put on as it often does, sort of a unanimous face, trying to tell the world that we're kind of all in this together. But this reporting, based on interviews with folks that worked at the court and some behind the scenes sleuthing from these dogged investigative reporters, has found that it was actually quite a fractious decision to put the code of ethics out at all, and over this question of whether the code should be enforceable. Of course, that was the sort of central theme of a lot of the criticism. That was certainly what we were most focused on. The court announced this code. They largely copied the enforceable lower court ethics code that applies to lower court judges. They weakened it in some important respects that we'll get into. But then, most importantly, they refused to bind themselves to any external enforcement mechanism, insulating themselves from accountability once again. Lisa, how did you respond to, yet another leak, itself a sign of the kind of institutional rot there at this once hallowed institution? How are you reading this news?
Well, I really appreciated the reporting by the New York Times about this and the insights that they gained from insiders. I think it was important for the public to understand what really happened, because John Roberts put one hell of a spin on that ethics code when he announced it. First of all, he claimed that it had basically always been in effect when obviously it was not. And second of all, that claim sort of was belied, or not sort of, in fact, was belied by the reality of the corruption that other investigative reporters have uncovered. So if it was in effect, it meant nothing, basically. It did nothing to keep Clarence Thomas from taking more than $4 million worth of luxury gifts from one of his billionaire buddies and other billionaires who've given him, a variety of things over the years. Did nothing to prevent Sam Alito from going off on the private jet of Paul Singer, and then later sitting on a case involving Paul Singer's financial interests. Did nothing to require the recusal of Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito in this most recent term this year in these cases involving January 6th. It basically means nothing. It's not worth the paper it's written on. But it was issued, in essence, as a statement by the court. And as you point out, it has, and others have pointed out, it has no enforcement provision, and that was by design from some of the most problematic actors on that court, from Alito, opposition by Alito and Thomas, who don't want there to be enforcement because it would constrain their activities, which I think have really created this cloud of corruption that surrounds the court. And there are other problems with that code, and also there's some interesting things about that story I'd love to talk with you about, Alex. But first of all, I just want to say thank you to the New York Times in this particular instance for this really important reporting about what was happening. And also, I want to thank the Democratic, the justices who were appointed by Democratic presidents who stood up for having an actual ethics code with actual enforcement, and who were shut down by these right-wing justices who want to be unaccountable and pretend that their unaccountability is so-called independence.
Independence, yeah. It's not to constrain, their ability to fly on private jets to Alaskan fishing vacations or on $500,000 trips to Indonesia with billionaires. It's to preserve their independence. And it's that. And Neil Gorsuch, the story explains, wrote a 10-page memo. They didn't use their normal email servers to have this debate over the ethics code and how it would be crafted and decided upon. They wrote private memos to each other. And we of course, don't have access to this 10-page screed that Gorsuch wrote because, of course, secrecy, the shroud of secrecy is essential, as everybody knows, to judicial independence. And so this is the line they're standing on, right? And it's sort of spelled out in the defense of this lack of enforcement, in the defense of this rampantly corrupt behavior by these right-wing Republican-appointed justices to critics, right? The defense of these justices to critics like ourselves is that, we are obviously motivated by partisanship, and because we don't like the outcomes, we're trying to destroy the integrity of the court. They're the ones that have destroyed the integrity of the court with their own behavior, with their own flagrantly partisan overreach. And I think too often we shy away from that, right? Of course, this is about common sense ethics, and the idea that the highest officials, the highest judges in the land should be bound by the basic common sense ethics requirements that bind every other federal official in the United States government. But it's part and parcel of what they are doing here, right? There is no independence, and they are trying to protect their ability to do whatever they want without accountability by smearing critics. And I think too often, and we saw this, play out in the Senate Judiciary Committee in its really dry and technocratic treatment of these scandalous stories that came out over the last year and a half. By treating this as sort of a narrow question of ethics. Of course, it is fundamentally a question of rules that should bind justices of all parties. And the story documents not a few instances in which Democratic appointed justices have abused these rules to take, very expensive trips paid for by people with interest before the court. But in this instance, it is directly connected to the outcomes. And it's not that we disagree as a matter of policy with those outcomes, which we tend to do, but because it's so transparent that this is a bought and paid for system, that these justices were put in place to deliver these outcomes, and that they're being rewarded for their fealty to these theocratic and billionaire interests with lavish luxury vacations and trips to, castles in Germany from far-right princesses, who the ethics code in its watered down form, conveniently leaves room for them to continue to do.
Yeah, I mean, it really is outrageous. A couple things that you said really spark in me some thoughts, Alex. Like, one of them is this notion that that their independence is threatened by obedience to an ethics code. That is just such a false premise. It's really an outrageous assertion by Neil Gorsuch. This story mentions that, perhaps he's sensitive because his mom was under investigation for allegations from an EPA insider that she misused the $1.6 billion Superfund trust that was supposed to be designed to protect us from toxic chemicals. If Neil Gorsuch still has his feelings hurt about an actual legitimate investigation into his mother, then he shouldn't be involved in these sorts of issues at all, quite frankly. But aside from that, the other thing that really is astonishing about both this news story and the so-called code is that it creates a notion that a justice has a, quote, duty to sit, even if ordinary people would think them not impartial. There's a perception of lack of partiality, or a reality of lack of partiality. They claim, and John Roberts has really orchestrated this, that because there are 9 of them, the duty to sit basically trumps the ethical duty that all the other judges in the country follow.
And that federal law requires, right? This is a matter of federal law that requires recusal in a case where a justice's impartiality might reasonably be questioned. And they have invented, a duty to sit. That's right there in the Constitution. No, actually, it's not in the Constitution, but federal law requires them to recuse.
Yeah. I mean, it's astonishing. So another invented doctrine, and this comes from basically this court that John Roberts has, in my view, abused the judicial office to concoct a notion of criminal immunity for a president that's never been done before. This is a court that has concocted a notion that, a public official can take a gratuity in the amount of $15,000, that somehow it's a tip for a job well done. This is a court that has concocted a new interpretation of the 14th Amendment in terms of the bar on insurrectionists. It concocted a notion that even a law that on its face says that if you try to disrupt an official proceeding, you're liable in criminal law. They ignored that language. So in some ways, it's no surprise that John Roberts and the right-wing appointees that he works with have sought to basically reinvent an ethics code that's basically a fantasy designed to insulate them from any accountability by basically leaving to themselves the judgment of whether they should recuse. And they have been proven over and over again. And you and I work with our great partners at Revolving Door Project and at Take Back the Courts to create a website called Supreme Transparency to show how these justices should be recusing themselves and how they're not. And then the other thing that I think is worth noting is, Lauren Windsor had that great breakthrough this summer from her undercover investigation at the Supreme Court Historical Society, in which basically Alito said the same thing. He dismissed the legitimate, very serious ethics issues that had been investigated by ProPublica, by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by Politico, dismissed all of those, that extraordinary documentation as just sour grapes. That is dangerous. It shows a real arrogance by these justices, by Justice Alito in particular. But it also just shows how out of touch they are and exactly why they should be subject to a binding ethical code that must be enforced by someone other than themselves. They literally cannot be entrusted to police themselves, as all those investigations reveal over and over and over again.
Yeah, that recusal point you raised is so important, and was apparently, according to the reporting, one of the major topics of debate and division among the justices, with the three Democratic appointees, insisting on enforcement, and Kagan apparently proposing a pretty common sense, workable system where they would have a panel and of lower court judges, retired lower court judges, that they could seek counsel from, and that actually would have created a safe harbor, so that if a justice sought that counsel and received advice and proceeded with whatever activity they were seeking counsel upon, they could then claim safe harbor for accusations of impropriety. But recusal is so central to this, right? Because the idea that a justice would remove themselves from a majority, it's not like the court loses any ability, going back to that duty to sit, it's not like the court would lose any ability to decide the outcome of a case. What it does is it reduces the Republican 6-3 supermajorities stacked odds of being able to prevail. And often, I think, for example, in some of the Trump cases, there were very strong basis for arguing, I think it's actually irrefutable, that federal law required the recusal of both Thomas and Alito. And of course, at the time where they were having this debate, and when they ultimately released that code, the information about Ginny Thomas's involvement in the January 6th insurrection was well known, but although not well known enough, I think there's still a lot we need to learn about that, and that the January 6th committee investigated, but did ultimately not produce, because Liz Cheney did not want that stuff public. But Alito's waving of these insurrectionist flags outside of his homes was known to the court, but not known to the public. And so you can see just how important it is for them to be able to avoid external enforcement, avoid the ability of anybody to stop them from just having their way with the power that they wield. I think that's just like such a critical detail from this story. Yeah. I don't know, Lisa, I think, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, because let's say it's a 4-3 court, because they should have certainly recused themselves under the federal code that is mandatory. Yeah. It's a shall, and it applies to justices. It's not just judges. It says expressly applying to justices. And so they absolutely should have recused themselves. But Roberts needed them as insulation, because look what happened in the Fisher case, one of those January 6th cases, where Amy Coney Barrett went to the other side basically and said that this statute that a number of these January 6th defendants were charged under, it's plain on its face, and it certainly should apply here. And so as that margin gets narrower, it makes it harder for John Roberts to do what he wants. And what he wanted to do this past year, as was documented again by the New York Times, was that he wanted to basically clear the deck for Trump to be able to move forward in this election and basically pardon him so that he could become president again. That's what the orchestration that he engaged in, I think, really reveals. But also, I think this idea, I just want to go back to this idea of duty to sit. It's invented, and yet it's being used to trump the actual federal statute. And as you point out, members of Congress like Jamie Raskin, Rep. Raskin, and others wrote to the court to say, you should recuse. These justices should have recused in these January 6 cases, and they did not. And so, to the extent that there's this notion that somehow the ethics code is being used to block their independence. It's actually being cited to try to preserve an independent court, to try to make sure that we don't have judges who are compromised deciding cases. And also this notion that it's the Democrats that are partisan on it is pretty outrageous, because just a couple of years ago, as you pointed out to me, Alex, you had Chuck Grassley and other Republicans signing on to some ethical reforms that now they've completely abandoned, like amnesia. They don't talk about it at all. It's extraordinary. And there's one other thing I was going to say that I feel like I just have to mention, which is there was another ProPublica report a few months ago, which was kind of in the midst of everything, so people may have missed it. But what it was Jenny Thomas caught on tape talking to Kelly Shackelford, one of the leaders of this thing called First Liberty that has a lot of cases before the court trying to destroy the separation of church and state, trying to advance this extreme anti-abortion, anti-gay agenda. And he's caught on tape basically saying that Elena Kagan is a traitor, that she committed treason for daring to support an enforceable code of conduct. So this racket where you have these groups that are funded by this dark money to bring cases to the court in order to remake our lives, remake our liberties. And then those groups are at the heart of what Jenny Thomas praised as defending the court against any ethical rules. I mean, that just stinks. It is outrageous. But so you have a group that comes before the court seeking decisions, changing our rights. And one of the justices' wives is there praising them for blocking, opposing ethics reforms. And that guy, Kelly Shackelford, has the audacity to call a sitting Supreme Court Justice, Elena Kagan, treasonous for daring to support a binding ethical code. That is so outside the pale. It is outrageous.
It's something. And you mentioned the letter that the members of Congress sent. A number of letters got sent. Raskin sent letters. Dan Goldman, the representative from New York, sent a letter. Durbin and Sheldon Whitehouse sent letters from the Senate. And what Alito sent back was, again, an invented reinterpretation, rewriting of the applicable law. And he did it in exactly the same way as these defenders we've been talking about, on the grounds of infringement of independence, and on the basis that anybody insisting on recusal or insisting on enforceable ethics obviously has a partisan bone to pick. The recusal statute, which requires, as you mentioned, recusal in it where a justice's impartiality shall reasonably be questioned, or could reasonably be questioned. He said, nobody that doesn't have a partisan bias could reasonably question his impartiality. But of course, the statute doesn't require, that nobody has a partisan bias. And in reality, there were numerous conservatives, prominent conservatives, even former Federalist Society, or even some current Federalist Society affiliated lawyers who were, acknowledging the appearance of impartiality and the reality of impartiality, produced by his decision to wave January 6th flags outside of his house. So here we are. I think we always like to try to drive home what we can do about this. I think it's essential that reporting and conversations like this continue to happen, because Americans are outraged about this across the board. It's not just progressives. It's not just Democrats. All the polling we've done and that we've seen shows widespread independent outrage over this. Republicans, a significant majority of Republicans think this is awful. Huge majorities, upwards of 80% of Americans, want common sense ethics reform, anti-corruption reform vis-a-vis this court. And the public faith and trust in this institution has plummeted. So I think particularly as we enter 2025, where the House will have a very narrow Republican majority, where there will be vulnerable Republican Senate senators who have important elections coming up in 2026. This is like a pressure point that we can lean on. These folks, as you mentioned, used to support these reforms. All of a sudden, they don't. Why not? And will they stand up for this type of corruption, for this type of secrecy? If they won't, we got to hang it around their necks.
Yep, that's exactly right, Alex. I mean, I think we have a lot of work to do together and with our friends and allies in the community to really get those phone lines lit up, to really make those calls, keep the pressure on, put the pressure on, because we're going to see a number of cases going up to the Supreme Court that has been corrupted. And we, and like you said, this is not actually a partisan issue. All the other judges in the country have enforceable ethical codes. They follow them. If they don't, there are consequences for them. This should be the norm. And we're going to have to really hold their feet to the fire, metaphorically, obviously, to get there. But just so glad to be on this show with you. So grateful for Legal AF and the Midas Touch Network, and hoping everyone will like us, sign up, join us, hit the button to become. Maybe it's the buttons over here. Anyway, hit the button, share with your friends, because there's more coming. We'll be doing more of these shows, and we're really grateful for this growing audience, to really spread the word about what's happening and also what we're going to need to do about it.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to see that 10-page memo from Gorsuch. Yeah, we might never see it, but let's put some pressure on the court to let us see that memo. Why does this stuff get to be shrouded in secrecy all the time? This is not how democracy.
Yeah, I agree.
Until next time.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel, where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.